I'm at the second part of this second lecture about Vonnegut, and this one is military-industrial complex. Now, some of you have taken, or may have taken, MIT 3440, and what you're going to hear here is going to be familiar. It's not going to take that long, but for those of you who haven't taken 3440, I want you just to sort of hear some of these numbers and see some of this, the reality basically of what kind of space is occupied by war in the current culture, apart from the some of the other spaces, because there are many. And if you're interested in this, I do recommend a book that I give a little slice of to 3440, which is called War for War, that course. But the book is called Counting for Nothing by Marilyn Waring. And Waring is a New Zealander, and she is a very bright woman, and she went off to the UN and dug around in their numbers and came up with these quite very upsetting numbers, basically about how much women's labor is not valued at all and how much male killing labor is valued. Now, we're at the point where women in both Canada and America can join the combat forces. I think all combat arms, I keep thinking there is 1% of the combat arms that are not open to women. I can't remember which it is. But otherwise, all the other combat arms are open. So anything from Navy SEAL, an Army Ranger, to bomber pilot or bomber, foot soldier, and so on, a woman can do. So it's not so much about whether or not women can be soldiers as what kind of labor do we value, and what do we put a price on. And it costs money to buy stuff to go to war, but we don't pay caregivers at all. And we complain about the fact that we have to give caregivers a year off after, they've had a child, and oh my God, what a hassle. Well, you would think that if we're so focused on children, and children are as important as we say they are, because everybody talks about their kids and how wonderful they are, that if they are the most wonderful thing in the culture, that we would actually be prepared to pay for them, and be prepared to pony up good money for good education and so on. Okay. Anyway, Marilyn Waring, Counting for Nothing. This discussion about the military-industrial complex then begins at the start of the 1960s, although the thing I'm talking about really begins in World War II. And at the end of his career, both as the top general really in the world and as a two-term president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike as he's known, said famously, in the councils of government, and I'll put this quotation up here, in the councils of government we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Okay, this was 1961. And Eisenhower knew this very well because he had been both essentially the president for 2 terms, very, very popular, and he'd also been the top general at the end of World War II. And so it was Eisenhower, who you may remember, who oversaw D-Day, and the decision to go ahead and launch the D-Day the D-Day invasions and attack Normandy and begin the year-long battle, basically, that was going to go on from June 1944 to basically May 1945, when finally the Allies would prevail over Germany, and the Americans would go on fighting in the Pacific until August 1945, when they dropped the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Eisenhower is experienced, very experienced, and it's a very interesting move on his part, and it's been discussed at length because this is one of the most famous speeches that he gave, that any president gave, really, in the 20th century. And there are a number right around this time. Kennedy gives some very famous speeches, very famous. Johnson is going to give some famous speeches. Nixon's going to give famous speeches. Anyway, so to go back to this for a minute, what Eisenhower is pointing to is the fact that the military and industry, industry that's making military stuff, has begun to move in and is getting into a three-way collaboration, basically. So the military, which is subordinate in the American world to the civilian command, that is, the commander-in-chief is the president, who, as you know, is a civilian usually. It has to be, actually. You can't be a general. If you are a general and you become a president, you become a civilian. Your rank becomes honorary. You're no longer a serving general. And that's part of that's written into the Constitution, I think. Yeah, it's in the Constitution. So you've got big industry that's making military stuff, like, say, Boeing, Lockheed, Raytheon, Grumman, GM, military, General Dynamics, all those different companies, Westinghouse, GE, and so on. And they're coming together with the military themselves and the Pentagon, and then that group is being met by people in government, senators particularly, and congresspeople, who are both in the federal government and in each local state government, because the United States has a series of state-governed, the states govern themselves, and there is the federal government, just the way we have the municipal governments, the provincial governments, and then a federal government as well. So the thing is that basically there's a combination that comes together of the military, industry, and politics. And they all get in each other's pockets to the extent that you can no longer separate them. And that's what Ike is pointing at. Right? So in World War II, companies that, say, made electrical parts and invested in high tech were going to be needed. You're going to have to. The American government went to GM and said, "You effectively are working for us now. I mean, we're going to pay you." And GM ballooned the size of GM, and Ford boomed. All war industries boomed during World War II. War is usually very good for industry. It can cause a inflationary recession, but it's good for industry. Chemical companies that make poison gases, napalm, other sorts of biological weapons, defoliants, which we'll see in Vietnam. All kinds of chemicals you might need become very important. People that make high temperature components that are going to go into aircraft makers, shipbuilders, and so on. The list goes on, right? You can imagine. And so in Germany, Germany went through the same thing. Every country in the world in World War II, if it wanted to participate basically and fight in World War II, had to arm. And if it was going to arm, it had to go to industry and say, "We need you to start inventing things." And that includes the Japanese, who didn't have a native plane manufacturer, and so they went to Mitsubishi, I guess, and said, "Make us a plane we can use as a killer." And that's where the Zero came from, which Miyazaki made a film of called The Wind Rises. Hey, good film, interesting. Okay, so somebody had to make. Not only had to make the nerve gas, say, that was used to gas 12 million people in the death camps, but also they had to make the death camps themselves. Like, people actually had to design those things. They had to design, like, this had never been done before. It's like we're going to design essentially slaughterhouses for human beings. What's that going to look like? And how's it going to work? People had to design it, right? So other companies, and they were punished. I mean, the companies that basically lost the war, so the German companies, Volkswagen, Porsche, IG Farben, Hecht, chemical companies, were punished. They were taken apart. IG Farben, which was this consortium of companies, was so powerful that it was pulled apart in the Nuremberg conventions. They were like, that's it. This company is no longer going to exist. They just pulled it into all its little different pieces. And you can actually still buy watercolors from Hecht. And Hecht made chemicals for IG Farben during World War II. So there's that, right? The same thing is true with Japan. The Allies, when they got to Germany and Japan, as I say, pulled these companies apart and said they will no longer exist as they are because they've been committing war crimes. Well, if it had gone the other way around, what do you think would have happened to GM, Dow Chemical, now it would be IBM, Apple? They would all be engaged in war manufacturers. Motorola, Hewlett-Packard, half of the business that they do is military business. So as far as an enemy coming to confront us would say, they're committing war atrocities against our civilians, and they would just be pulled apart. So you can see where, you think, oh, well, Volkswagen for sure must have been pulled apart because actually Volkswagen was partly designed by Hitler. No. Americans got to it. They were like, Volkswagen, we're going to keep this going. And of course, they began to appear in America in the 60s. Anyway, so what is Ike talking about? What's the extent of this? Okay, so here's some numbers for you. And these numbers are, man, I used to use these numbers 20 years ago. So these numbers are at least 20 years old. The United States made a huge investment in its military after World War II. According to the Department of Defense, the DoD, from 1947 to 1992, so for basically 45 years, the country spent approximately $10.2 trillion for national defense in constant 1987 dollars. So because sometimes like $1 billion in 1945 would equal $1 trillion now, like that kind of thing in terms of the scale of what the money is worth and so on. So in constant dollars, $10.2 trillion. Which is, we consider that to be now nothing. That's the nuclear weapons production industry alone, consisting of 3 primary weapons laboratories, 9 factories that produce nuclear materials, 7 warhead assembly plants. This sounds like a Christmas song, right? It sounds like My True Love Sent to Me. And 2 test sites for nuclear weapons, all of them government-owned, operated on a budget of $8.7 billion in 1987, and employed 115,000 people, right? Which is a third of the size of London. So it's basically a third of London working for nuclear weapons, the nuclear weapons industry. At the same time, private military industrial firms enjoyed an even more lucrative position. So there's the stuff that the government owns, because the government, for instance, because of the Atomic Energy Commission and the Department of Energy, the Department of Energy is what oversees nuclear weapons. It was a turf fight and they won. They own essentially these manufacturing test sites and so on, so like White Sands and so on. That's a government property. But then there are the non-government properties, right, which industry owns. But they're military industries, private military industries, right, enjoyed an even more lucrative position. In the fiscal year 1990, so 30 years ago, U.S. private military contractors received contract awards totaling more than $121 billion, which, as I say, these days, that seems like chicken feed. Although several of the largest defense contractors are also commercial companies. So General Electric and General Motors are the nation's 3rd and 4th largest defense contractors. Their defense divisions, like defense firms, differ fundamentally from their civilian counterparts. Okay, so this is from Grolier, which was an encyclopedia at the time. And what's important about that is that, so there's GE domestic and GE defense. So you can buy a GE microwave or refrigerator or something like that, but you also can buy component parts from GE to put in a cruise missile or into a nuclear weapon. So there are these 2 different parts.